A single key dangles from a rusted chain, worn smooth by decades of nervous handling. Frank Holloway clutches it every morning at 6 a.m. sharp, staring at room 12's faded green door. The Crescent Pines Motel closed in 1953, yet Frank never left. For 70 years he's waited for someone who checked in but never checked out. The key to room 12 has never been returned, and Frank swears the guest is still inside, waiting. But before we dive into Frank's disturbing vigil, I need to ask you something. If stories like this fascinate you, if you're drawn to mysteries that blur the line between reality and nightmare, then subscribe to Dark Heritage Files. Hit that notification bell and let me know in the comments what city and country you're watching from. We're building a community of mystery lovers from around the world, and I'd love to know where this story is reaching you tonight. Now let me take you back to a stretch of Texas highway where the truth is stranger and more terrifying than any ghost story you've ever heard. According to local records and the fragmented memories passed down by longtime residents of the area, what I'm about to tell you began on a scorching summer night in 1952, when the post-war boom had yet to reach the forgotten corners of rural Texas. Highway 83 cuts through East Texas like a scar across weathered skin, connecting small towns that time forgot to remember. In 1952, this ribbon of cracked asphalt carried more than just travelers. It carried dreams, desperation, and sometimes darkness that would haunt the region for decades to come. The Crescent Pines Motel sat 20 miles south of Marshall, Texas, where the piney woods gave way to rolling farmland. Built in 1947 by Harold Crescent, a former oil worker who'd saved every penny from his time in the Kilgore fields, the motel represented hope in the post-war boom. 12 rooms arranged in a horseshoe around a gravel courtyard, each painted the color of sagebrush, with screen doors that rattled in the hot Texas wind. Frank Holloway arrived at the Crescent Pines in the spring of 1949, 23 years old and running from a failed marriage in Louisiana. Harold hired him as night manager, drawn to Frank's quiet intensity and his willingness to work for room and board plus $30 a week. Frank took up residence in the small apartment behind the office, a cramped space that smelled of coffee grounds and motor oil. The motel catered to traveling salesmen, oil field workers, and the occasional family making the long drive between Dallas and Shreveport. Business was steady if not spectacular. Frank proved reliable, maintaining the property with military precision, keeping immaculate records, and treating every guest with professional courtesy. Harold often said Frank had a gift for hospitality. He remembered every guest's name, their preferences, even their troubles. By 1951, Frank had become indispensable. When Harold's arthritis worsened, Frank essentially ran the operation alone. The older man trusted him completely, often saying Frank treated the motel like it was his own. This trust would prove to be both Frank's salvation and his curse. The motel's location made it ideal for more than just legitimate travelers. Highway 83 served as a corridor for various enterprises that thrived in the shadows of post-war America. Labor contractors moved through regularly, transporting workers from the Rio Grande Valley to farms and factories across East Texas. Most of these operations were legitimate, but some existed in the gray areas where desperation met opportunity, and law enforcement rarely ventured. On August 15, 1952, a dusty Buick pulled into the Crescent Pines just after midnight. Frank was reading behind the reception desk when the headlights swept across the office windows. 3 men emerged from the vehicle, 2 Anglo men in work clothes and a younger Hispanic man who seemed nervous, constantly looking over his shoulder. The driver, who introduced himself as Ed Morrison, requested 2 rooms for the night. He explained they were labor contractors heading to Henderson County in the morning, and the young man with them, Carlos Mendez, was a worker they were transporting. Morrison paid in cash, signing the register with a flourish that seemed practiced. Frank assigned them rooms 11 and 12, noting in his records that Morrison and his partner, Jimmy Walsh, took room 11, while Carlos was given room 12. This arrangement struck Frank as odd. Typically, in his experience with labor contractors, the workers bunked together while contractors took separate accommodations. But Morrison insisted on this specific arrangement, and his manner discouraged questions. Over the following months, this pattern repeated. Morrison and Walsh would arrive every few weeks, always with a different young Hispanic worker, always requesting the same room arrangement. The workers were invariably quiet, often appearing exhausted or troubled. Frank began to notice they rarely spoke English well, and many seemed confused about where they were or where they were going. Initially, Frank felt sympathy for these workers. The post-war economic boom had created enormous demand for farm labor, and he understood that many Mexican nationals were crossing the border seeking better opportunities. What troubled him was the workers' demeanor. They seemed less like hopeful immigrants and more like frightened prisoners. The turning point came in November 1952, when Morrison arrived with a young woman instead of the usual male workers. Maria Santos appeared to be in her early 20s, with dark hair braided down her back and eyes that held intelligence despite her obvious exhaustion. Unlike the previous workers, Maria spoke excellent English, having attended school in Laredo before her family fell on hard times. Frank found himself drawn to Maria's plight. During the brief conversation they had while Morrison and Walsh loaded supplies from their car, Maria mentioned she'd been promised work at a private school in Henderson County, teaching Spanish to the children of wealthy oil executives. The story sounded legitimate, yet something in her tone suggested doubt. That night, Frank heard raised voices from room 12. The argument was in Spanish, but Maria's distress was unmistakable. When Frank approached the window to investigate, the voices stopped abruptly. The next morning, Morrison claimed Maria had changed her mind about the job, and they were taking her back to the border. They left before dawn, but Frank noticed they headed north on Highway 83, not south toward Mexico. 3 weeks later, Morrison returned alone and requested room 12 specifically. He spent the entire night cleaning it meticulously, using bleach and industrial-strength detergent he'd brought in a toolbox. When Frank questioned him the next morning, Morrison explained that the previous occupant had been sick, and he wanted to ensure the room was properly sanitized out of courtesy to the motel. This explanation satisfied Frank at the time, but doubt began growing in his mind. The workers Morrison transported had stopped arriving altogether after Maria's visit. When Frank casually asked about the change in business, Morrison claimed the labor market had shifted and he was focusing on other opportunities. Winter settled over East Texas with unusual harshness in late 1952. The Crescent Pines saw fewer travelers as the cold weather discouraged all but essential travel. Frank found himself with time to think, and his thoughts increasingly turned to the workers Morrison had transported, especially Maria Santos. Harold Crescent's health continued declining, and by January 1953, he spent most days in bed, leaving Frank to run the motel completely independently. This isolation gave Frank space to investigate his suspicions about Morrison's operation, though he had little idea where to begin. The breakthrough came in February 1953, when a Mexican-American family stopped at the motel while traveling to visit relatives in Marshall. During casual conversation, Frank mentioned the labor contractors who had frequented the establishment. The family's father, Roberto Herrera, worked for the Texas Employment Commission and was familiar with legitimate labor recruitment operations throughout the region. When Frank described Morrison and Walsh, Roberto's expression grew troubled. He explained that several families in South Texas had reported relatives disappearing after accepting job offers from men matching their descriptions. These jobs, supposedly at schools or private estates, never materialized. The workers simply vanished, with their families receiving no communication despite promises of regular contact. Roberto suggested Frank contact the Texas Rangers if he suspected criminal activity, but Frank hesitated. He had no concrete evidence, only suspicions and circumstantial observations. Moreover, he'd accepted money from Morrison for the room rentals, which could be construed as complicity if the operation proved illegal. This moral paralysis would haunt Frank for the rest of his life. Over the following weeks, he drafted several letters to law enforcement, but never sent them. He told himself he needed more evidence, but the truth was simpler and more damning. He was afraid of the consequences of involvement. The final piece of the puzzle arrived in March 1953, when Harold Crescent died peacefully in his sleep. Frank discovered among Harold's papers a life insurance policy that named Frank as beneficiary, along with a will leaving him the motel property. Harold had treated Frank like the son he'd never had, and this final gesture of trust only intensified Frank's guilt about the secrets he'd kept. As Frank prepared for Harold's funeral, he found himself alone in room 12, ostensibly cleaning it for future guests. But as he stood in the space where Maria Santos had spent her final night of freedom, the weight of his inaction became unbearable. He realized that his silence had made him complicit in whatever had happened to her and the other workers. That evening, Frank made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He removed the key to room 12 from the front desk and placed it on his personal keychain. If he couldn't save Maria or seek justice for the crimes he'd witnessed, he could at least ensure that room 12 remained a memorial to her memory. He would never rent it to another guest. Spring of 1953 brought an unexpected visitor to the Crescent Pines. Sheriff Tom Bradley of Harrison County arrived on a Tuesday morning, explaining that his department was investigating reports of missing persons connected to labor recruitment operations in the area. Frank's heart pounded as he realized the moment he dreaded had finally arrived. Sheriff Bradley was a veteran lawman in his 50s, weathered by years of dealing with the complexities of East Texas justice. He'd served in the Pacific during the war and returned home with little tolerance for exploitation of vulnerable people. Recent reports from families in the Rio Grande Valley had reached his desk, and he was methodically investigating all establishments that might have housed suspicious labor contractors. When Bradley asked about Morrison and Walsh, Frank faced the defining choice of his life. He could tell the truth, potentially exposing his own complicity, or maintain the silence that had protected him for months. The memory of Maria's frightened eyes made the decision for him. Frank told Bradley everything: the suspicious room arrangements, the frightened workers, Maria's disappearance, and Morrison's middle-of-the-night cleaning of room 12. As he spoke, he saw the sheriff's expression harden with recognition. Bradley had clearly encountered similar patterns elsewhere. Bradley immediately secured room 12 as a potential crime scene, though he explained to Frank that the extensive cleaning Morrison had performed likely eliminated most physical evidence. However, he arranged for investigators from the Department of Public Safety to examine the room thoroughly, hoping to find traces that amateur cleaning might have missed. The investigation revealed traces of blood beneath the floorboards near the bathroom, along with strands of hair that had been missed during Morrison's hasty cleanup. More significantly, investigators found a small piece of jewelry, a silver cross on a delicate chain, wedged behind the radiator where it had apparently fallen during a struggle. When Bradley showed Frank the cross, he immediately recognized it. Maria had worn it during their brief conversation, touching it nervously as she spoke about her doubts regarding the promised teaching position. Seeing it again, tarnished and bent, made the reality of her fate undeniable. The investigation expanded rapidly once physical evidence emerged. Bradley contacted law enforcement agencies across Texas and neighboring states, sharing information about Morrison and Walsh's operation. Within weeks, a broader picture emerged of a human trafficking network that had operated across rural Texas for nearly 2 years. The scheme was brutally simple yet effective. Morrison and Walsh targeted vulnerable individuals in border communities, promising legitimate employment opportunities in interior regions of Texas. They transported victims to remote locations where they were forced into various forms of labor: agricultural work, domestic servitude, and worse. Those who resisted or threatened to expose the operation were eliminated. Maria Santos had been different from most victims because of her education and language skills. She'd quickly recognized that the promised teaching position was fabricated and had threatened to contact authorities. This threat had sealed her fate. Morrison and Walsh couldn't risk exposure by an articulate victim who could communicate effectively with law enforcement. The investigation's progress brought Frank both relief and renewed anguish. relief that justice might finally be served, and anguish at the realization that his earlier silence had potentially cost other victims their lives. If he'd contacted authorities after Maria's disappearance, subsequent victims might have been saved. Sheriff Bradley, recognizing Frank's torment, assured him that his cooperation was proving invaluable to the broader investigation. The detailed records Frank had maintained, documenting dates, vehicle descriptions, and behavioral observations, provided crucial evidence for building cases against the traffickers. By summer 1953, law enforcement had identified Morrison and Walsh's real identities. Earl Morrison was actually Edward Kowalski, a former soldier with a dishonorable discharge and previous arrests for fraud. Jimmy Walsh was James Walensky, Kowalski's cousin and partner in various criminal enterprises. Both men had extensive criminal records in Illinois and Oklahoma before moving their operation to Texas. The manhunt intensified when investigators discovered that Kowalski and Walensky had murdered at least 6 people connected to their trafficking operation, including 3 workers who had attempted to escape and 2 local men who had stumbled upon their activities. Maria Santos had been their most recent victim, killed in room 12 when she'd threatened to expose their operation to authorities. Frank's role in the investigation made him a target. In August 1953, Sheriff Bradley warned him that Kowalski and Walensky were likely aware that the Crescent Pines had become the center of the investigation. Bradley offered to arrange protective custody for Frank, but he refused to leave the motel. His obsession with room 12 had become complete. He felt that abandoning it would be abandoning Maria's memory. This decision nearly cost Frank his life. On the night of August 20, 1953, Kowalski returned to the Crescent Pines, intending to eliminate Frank as a witness. Frank was in room 12, as had become his nightly ritual, when he heard the office door being forced open. Years of guilt and preparation had led him to keep Harold's old shotgun in the room, and he was ready when Kowalski kicked in the door. The confrontation lasted only seconds. Kowalski, desperate and cornered, had come to kill Frank and destroy any remaining evidence. But Frank's guilt had transformed into a fierce protectiveness of Maria's memory. He fired twice, killing Kowalski instantly on the threshold of room 12. Walensky, who had been waiting in their car as a lookout, fled when he heard the gunshots. He was captured 3 days later trying to cross into Mexico, and his subsequent confession provided the final details needed to understand the full scope of the trafficking operation. The investigation concluded with convictions for multiple murders and human trafficking charges. Justice had been served, but Frank found no peace in the outcome. The weight of his delayed action continued to torment him, and his obsession with room 12 deepened rather than diminished. Sheriff Bradley visited Frank regularly in the months following the trial, concerned about the man's deteriorating mental state. Frank had transformed room 12 into a shrine of sorts, not with religious artifacts or photographs, but with meticulous maintenance. Every day, he cleaned the room as if preparing for Maria's return, changed the sheets, and ensured everything was exactly as it had been during her stay. The key to room 12 never left Frank's possession. He carried it everywhere, checking it obsessively as if ensuring it couldn't be lost or stolen. When Bradley suggested Frank might benefit from talking to a counselor about his experiences, Frank's response revealed the depth of his psychological transformation. "She never checked out," Frank explained with the calm certainty of someone stating an obvious fact. "Her key was never returned. Until she checks out properly, I can't rent the room to anyone else. That wouldn't be right." Bradley realized that Frank's guilt had evolved into a form of magical thinking. By maintaining room 12 in perpetual readiness, Frank believed he was somehow protecting Maria's memory and atoning for his failure to save her life. The key had become a tangible symbol of his responsibility. As long as he possessed it, he remained connected to her story. In 1954, Frank officially closed the Crescent Pines to public business, though he continued living on the property. He used the modest inheritance from Harold Crescent to maintain the buildings and grounds, creating the appearance of an operational motel while never accepting another guest. Room 12 remained the center of his daily routine. Cleaned, maintained, and ready for an occupant who would never return. Neighbors and local law enforcement understood Frank's situation and generally left him alone. Sheriff Bradley checked on him periodically, ensuring he had food and medical care when needed. The community viewed Frank as a victim of circumstances, a good man broken by witnessing horrors he couldn't prevent. Over the decades, Frank's routine never varied. Every morning at 6 a.m. he would walk to room 12, key in hand, and stand before the door. He would check that the key was properly attached to its chain, ensure the door was securely locked, then proceed with his daily maintenance of the property. To Frank, this ritual represented his ongoing responsibility to Maria Santos. He was her eternal desk clerk, maintaining her room until she was ready to check out. The truth about Frank Holloway and Room 12 might have remained a local curiosity, if not for the persistence of local historian Janet Morrison, no relation to the criminal, who began documenting the area's history in the 1980s. Her interviews with retired Sheriff Bradley and other community members revealed the full story of the Crescent Pines and its connection to the human trafficking case that had shocked East Texas decades earlier. Janet's research confirmed that Frank's obsession with Room 12 stemmed from genuine trauma and guilt over his failure to act sooner to help the trafficking victims. The key he carried represented his self-imposed penance, a daily reminder of the responsibility he felt toward Maria Santos and the other victims whose suffering he might have prevented. By the 1990s, Frank had become something of a local legend. Travelers on Highway 83 occasionally noticed the well-maintained but obviously closed motel, with its lone inhabitant visible through the office windows. Those who stopped to inquire were politely but firmly told that the establishment was permanently closed, though Frank never explained why. Frank Holloway died in his sleep in March 2023 at the age of 97. He was found in his apartment behind the office, still clutching the key to Room 12. Local authorities discovered detailed journals Frank had kept for 7 decades, documenting his daily maintenance of the room and his ongoing sense of responsibility toward Maria Santos. The Crescent Pines Motel was demolished 6 months after Frank's death. The property now sits empty, marked only by a historical marker placed by the Harrison County Historical Society. The marker mentions the motel's connection to a significant human trafficking investigation, but doesn't detail the psychological toll the case took on one man who witnessed it. Room 12's key disappeared during the demolition process. Workers assumed it was thrown away with other debris. But some locals believe Frank arranged for its preservation somehow. Whether the key still exists or not, its symbolic power remains. A reminder of how guilt and responsibility can transform a person's entire life, binding them permanently to a moment they wish they could change. Frank Holloway's 70-year vigil at the Crescent Pines demonstrates the lasting power of moral trauma. His refusal to rent Room 12 to another guest wasn't madness. It was an elaborate form of atonement, a way of ensuring that Maria Santos's story would never be forgotten. In his mind, keeping her room ready meant keeping her memory alive, and maintaining that memory was the only way he could find meaning in his failure to save her. This story forces us to consider our own moral responsibilities when we witness injustice or suspect wrongdoing. Frank's tragedy wasn't just that he failed to act quickly enough to save Maria Santos. It was that he spent the rest of his life punishing himself for a very human moment of fear and uncertainty. Sometimes the most haunting rooms aren't occupied by ghosts, but by the living weight of our own consciences. What do you think about Frank's lifelong vigil? Was his devotion to Room 12 a form of justice or a prison of his own making? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, please subscribe to Dark Heritage Files and hit that notification bell so you won't miss our upcoming investigations into the dark corners of American history. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most terrifying mysteries are the ones we create for ourselves.